الو يا دكتور 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 أحمد.
Greetings. In this video, I'd like to discuss a claim which has been made by a few different people in recent years. The claim is basically that the markings on the pews at First African Baptist Church show that the congregants there knew Hebrew, apparently when no one else did. Now, those familiar with discussions on the pews at First African Baptist Church already know that the claim that Hebrew appears on the pews is, at best, open to question, you know. Some might feel that it strains credulity, but some go beyond merely claiming that people at the church were writing Hebrew on the pews and go beyond that and insinuate that the congregants were among a select few who knew Hebrew at the time, as according to this claim, Hebrew had not yet been rediscovered. And so basically the congregants at First African Baptist Church were, you know, the only ones who knew. They knew when almost no one else did. So that's going to be the question explored in this video. Did First African Baptist Church know Hebrew when no one else did? Or, considering that now some proponents of the claim of Hebrew on the pews now claim that the congregants at First African Baptist Church were Sephardic Jews, so maybe Sephardic Jewry is excluded from this. Perhaps we could narrow the claim to just that First African Baptist Church knew Hebrew before European Jewry, or at least before the Ashkenazi side of the Jewish spectrum, right? That aspect of European Jewry and global Jewry. And I say this because, as you'll see in a moment, the claim centers on specifically Eliezer ben Yehuda and an assumed ignorance of the language before ben Yehuda began his work. And you see how that sort of draws in the Ashkenazi spectrum. So in this more narrow sense, the basic structure of the claim is that the Hebrew language was lost for centuries, and then it was rediscovered in the 1880s by Eliezer ben Yehuda. And as the claim goes, no Ashkenazim knew Hebrew in the centuries before that rediscovery, but the congregants at First African Baptist Church knew Hebrew well before that time, and this is demonstrable because they were writing it on the pews at that church. So let's consider a few examples of people making this claim. The first time I saw it come up was in Kelly Richardson's video titled Exposed, the Erasing History on the As Gods Movement channel, which he actually shot inside First African Baptist Church. And I'll share a link in the video description. I'll share links to all the sources of the clips I show in this video. But here, listen to what our beloved friend, Kelly Richardson says here.
These are the pews right here. These are the pews. These are the pews. Look at the writing. Look at the ancient writings. These are writings from our ancestors back in the 1700s, the 1800s. You know, how is it that our ancestors back in 1773 was writing in the Hebraic language at a time where as though Hebrew supposedly was redeveloped or rediscovered back in 1855? How were they able to do this?
Aside from that, Kelly Richardson also made a similar claim on Facebook years ago. And so here's a clip of Vocab Malone reading the relevant Facebook post a couple of years ago.
Eliezer ben Yehuda, the father of modern Hebrew, Yiddish. By the way, this is a Kelly Richardson post from 2017, in which he began to create in 1881. According to history, the Hebrew language was lost. Yet in Savannah, Georgia, there is a church that was built over a century prior to this new creation of modern Hebrew. Oh my gosh, this is fraught with problems. I forgot about this, how bad this post is. This entire church was built in 1773 by the hands of Negro slaves. These slaves also built the pews in which they are still in the sanctuary this very day, in which these Negro slaves wrote in a cursive Hebrew comparable to the 2nd century BC. What's amazing, not one Hebrew scholar can translate the writing. I'm sorry.
And the claim came up again when the Jude 3 project interviewed the Christian rapper Street Hymns. So here, listen to what he says in this clip.
One of the biggest things for me aside from the historical aspect, was a part of history for myself. So there's a church in Savannah, Georgia called First African Baptist Church. And this church was built in 1859 by slaves. And on the side of the pews is Hebrew writing. It is a mixture of Hebrew Latin writing. It's called Ladino, right? And the Ladino is Hebrew Latin. Why? Because Spain and Portugal, right? And the Hebrew language was not revived until, according to America, I think 1881, right? So this is roughly 30 years beforehand. So who taught them how to do this?
And this claim was also alluded to in passing in the documentary titled Reclaiming the Throne. Now, the full documentary appears on Vimeo, and again, I'll share a link in the video description. As I said, I'll provide links to all the clips shown here. But in that documentary, Reclaiming the Throne, in the midst of claiming that Hebrew appears on the pews, a passing reference is made to modern Hebrew not being invented until the late 1800s. And notice how, as that's being said, the visual graphics attempt to point to markings on the pews which resemble individual Hebrew characters. Okay, here's the clip. And by the way, fair use.
Remember, modernized Hebrew didn't exist till the late 1800s and was invented by a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda.
So after seeing those clips, you should have a good sense of the claim. Now, admittedly, the claim is somewhat vague, and I suspect that may be because it has not been carefully thought out, with all due respect to the proponents of the claim. But as they say, clear writing and likewise clear speaking requires clear thinking. But nonetheless, as was touched on before, a little bit earlier, the gist of the argument is that Hebrew was lost for centuries until Eliezer ben Yehuda resurrected it in the 1880s, and then the claim posits that, or let's say the proponents of this claim, they ask rhetorically, how then did congregants at First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia, know Hebrew, right? That's the gist of it. The Ashkenazim were ignorant of Hebrew at this time, but the congregants at First African Baptist Church knew Hebrew, and you can see this because they were writing Hebrew on the pews, and that's where that rhetorical question comes in, like how could they know this? But nonetheless, let's discuss this. See, first, on a minor note, let's clear up one misconception, and that's the misconception that Hebrew is lost. While Hebrew ceased to be a living language, knowledge of the language continued to exist. And what I mean by that is that there was a long period in which there were no communities where people were simply speaking Hebrew regularly, naturally, as their mother tongues, right? But it nonetheless remained a liturgical language and the language of scholarship. For an analogy, Latin has likewise now ceased to be a living language, right? There are likewise no communities where people simply speak Latin naturally and regularly, as their mother tongue, right? But that does not mean that knowledge of Latin is lost. There are still folks who study Latin, read Latin, pray in Latin. I myself pray in Latin regularly every day. People who use Latin in their liturgy, who translate Latin texts into other languages, etc., right? So that's similar. That provides an analogy for the case with Hebrew, right? The knowledge of the Hebrew language was not lost. It just ceased to be a living language. But that aside, that minor point aside, now that we've cleared that misconception up, let's get to the more significant issue with this claim. If proponents of this view are claiming that the congregants of First African Baptist Church knew Hebrew and were writing it on the pews, your first question should be, can we see some of this Hebrew? Now, on a personal note, I've looked into this topic for years now, and I must confess I find it troubling that thus far no one has managed to produce anything clear and coherent. And that fact fills me with doubt at this point. But notice how in the clip from the documentary, they merely showed a vague resemblance to two characters in isolation. And that aside, also consider this video from the We Woke Now channel from last January titled CRAFTY COUNSEL, Blatant Liars 4, and with the humorous subtitle, Don't Need Fake Scholars. So, and I'll provide a link to that video in the video description. But note that video was made by a person who has been involved in the Pews debate, and discussion on the pews. He's been involved with the pews for years, and he likewise claims to have images of all the pews. You know, a lot of people, myself included, have only seen a fraction of the pews. He's bragged multiple times that he's seen all the pews and has images of all the pews. So what did he put forth after years of this sort of intimate familiarity with the pews? Well, at one point, he shares an email from an unknown person, you know, an anonymous email, which tentatively proposes that some of the markings resemble a string of characters, specifically the characters Lamed, Resh, Yod, Yod, Tet, right? And as that doesn't amount to anything coherent in Hebrew, this anonymous source lightheartedly suggests that it could be English in the Hebrew script. You know, and then aside from that, later in the same video, the host, and I'm referring to our dearly beloved friend, the good doctor, Kelly Richardson, looks at the same markings and proposes that they form a different string of Hebrew characters, forming a completely ahistorical spelling of Israel with 5 yods, a zayin, and no aleph, right? And likewise, that's not coherent Hebrew. Neither of these two suggestions are coherent Hebrew. But now I want you to take a moment to think about this. This is the best that has been publicly put forth so far. And this is supposed to be indicative of the Hebrew which the congregants at First African Baptist Church were writing in, and which the Ashkenaz were allegedly ignorant of. Now, really, think about this. If that can pass for Hebrew, right? If that is their standard for demonstrating the presence of Hebrew, if that is representative of their definition of Hebrew, then let's be frank. Any Yiddish text could easily meet that definition of quote-unquote Hebrew. You know, with all due respect to the different folks making this claim, they seem to have oversold the claim. You know, they insinuated that the congregants who made the markings on the pews possessed the knowledge of Hebrew, which Ashkenazim lacked prior to Eliezer ben Yehuda. But when you actually dig into the markings, right, and you know, as well as digging into the claimant's attempts to interpret those markings, suddenly the bar for demonstrating knowledge of Hebrew is set so low that the very Ashkenazim they depicted as ignorant can meet that new standard, right? Even people wholly ignorant of Hebrew, who only knew Yiddish, could meet this low standard for demonstrating knowledge of Hebrew. Remember that. Keep that in mind for when the next time you come across this claim. On a side note, you know, the different proposals for the markings shown in this video were all from the same single pew, right? This pew, which you see on your screen. Now, note that 3 different interpretations were given for the same single marking, right? It's this marking right here. This marking was likened to a tau, or tav, to a tau by the documentary, right? And it was likened to a tet by the anonymous email, which the good doctor shared, and then it was declared to be a lamed by the good doctor himself, right? And, you know, I could say more, but interested viewers can see my past videos on, you know, methodologies for interpreting the pews, so I'll stop here, right? But mainly I want you to keep that in mind, that this claim of, you know, the markings demonstrating a knowledge of Hebrew, which nobody else had, really crumbles upon close inspection. You know, the actual markings which are presented as containing Hebrew within them are so vague and so open to interpretation, and the interpretations which are put forth are, with all due respect, so incoherent that in order to make, you know, to reach the conclusion that they're Hebrew, you have to set a very, very, very low standard. You have to have a very, very loose and open-ended, you know, definition of Hebrew. So in a sense, before you examine the claim, right, you don't realize, or you may not have realized, that they're holding the Ashkenaz to one standard, and then they're holding the markings to a completely different standard, right? But if they were actually consistent, the whole thing falls apart. But whatever the case, as I said, I'll stop here. I'm going to close here with the cloud interpreting scene in the 1948 film adaptation of Hamlet, which I actually previously shared in my video titled Dogma and Dogma. And, you know, as always, I look forward to the comments of others, and I hope to have a bunch of new videos in the coming days or weeks or months. But whatever the case, God bless.
Do you see yonder cloud that's almost in shape of a camel?
By the mass, and 'tis like a camel indeed.
Methinks it's like a weasel.
It is backed like a weasel.
Or like a whale?
Very like a whale.